Indeed, CQ, CQ, CQ. It's Tuesday, and that's when we do the Morse code CQ, which says we're calling anybody who wants to listen. We'd like to talk to anybody out there. We aren't trying to just find the person. We're trying to find you, and you are the person we'd like to talk to. And one of the keys to good radio, in fact, it's the key to almost any good conversation, is who are you talking to? Do you know who you're trying to reach? You are one person talking to another person. You see, also, when it's radio, it is one person who's blind talking to another person who is blind. Oh, there's so much to know about how to do a good radio program, and we're going to be teaching you how to do that. And it's something you probably never thought you would have to learn, but the way the world is working now, you're going to have to learn whether you actually do a radio program or not, or do a podcast, or do a video. That is the way business is done these days. And so, whatever business you're in, you're going to have to learn something about the radio, the video, the electronic internet media, to learn how to use them, and maybe how not to use them, and even more importantly, not how to be used by them. Be a media savvy. Hey, today I'm going to talk about a subject that I had never thought I'd have to talk about, but it did happen to me. And so you saw the program right. The millionaire next door. That didn't happen to me. The sociopath next door. And so if you'll just give me about 20 minutes, maybe a little bit less today because you're busy, I'd like to just briefly introduce you to something that would be helpful for you to know about life and business, maybe money, but then about who's out there and how you have to be so careful today. The program is interesting ideas and hopefully inspiring and instructive, and that program starts right now. Well, here we go. As I said, one of the things you find in life is, the old John Lennon line, life is what happens when you're making other plans. And now I used to teach people, and I still do to some extent, is begin with the end in mind. How do you want to be? As Stephen Covey said, where do you want to be in 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years? Well, begin with the end in mind. But even though you are one of the best at doing that, things happen. And even though you made the best of plans and the best of intentions, and you were one of those 3% of the population who kept your eye on the mark and your eye on the goal, and you worked hard and you did everything you could to do it right, and actually have a touch of humility about it, but you were good at what you did, and you did it well, and you worked hard, and you followed all the rules, and still you kind of missed in some ways, or you just simply got knocked off tracks in some ways. Somebody betrayed you in some way. Something bad happened. And so you had to pick yourself up and brush yourself off and get right back at it again. So things that we weren't expecting happened to us. Now, I'm not going to give you the full details, but I did have to because of an incident and something that happened. I had to do a little research on sociopathy. Sociopathy. That's the study of sociopaths. And so I'm going to show you a little bit of what I learned, but I want to begin with a fun beginning, and that was something that was just as I said, the millionaire next door. Now, the millionaire next door, that would be nice, perhaps, and the sociopath next door. Unfortunately, they might be both, but not usually according to Tom Stanley and William Danko. A number of years ago, and I was working in the financial services, they had a book that became a bestseller. Because Tom Stanley was a university professor and he wasn't making much money. And there was a time when that was true of all teachers. They didn't make a lot of money. And so he decided to go out and find out, the people who made money, they were millionaires. How did they become millionaires? And what he found out is that, first of all, a lot of people who live like millionaires, or at least put on that they are, they're in debt. They aren't millionaires. There's a lot of people who look and act like millionaires until it catches up with them and they fall apart, but they're not millionaires. Then, of course, he wasn't particularly interested in those who hit the big time, They made it. They did something. It wasn't winning the lottery. He found out that most millionaires would never play the lottery. And as a result, he wasn't talking to big-time millionaires. What fascinated him was to find people who were the millionaires next door. And what it was is these were average, ordinary people. And, he said, this is what happened. Well, they worked hard. They made a good living. They saved money. They invested wisely, but they didn't have much to invest. But what they did, they lived as basically as they could within their means. They drove, here's what happened. They drove an ordinary automobile. In fact, they looked like the people next door. They didn't have a big fancy house. They didn't drive a new car every year. In effect, they didn't live like millionaires. They lived comfortably, reasonably. It turns out they actually gave a lot of money away. They were people who were generous, and they were the kind of people you would like to have neighbors next door. But what happened is, as they were trying to put their life together and think about, well, will we be able to retire? All of a sudden, they started to add up their net worth. Well, here was their home, and here's how much they owed on it, or whether it was paid for. Here was their automobile. Here was their savings. Here's what this was. And they started to add up their assets that they had accumulated in 30 or 40 years of working. And guess what? It was 7 figures. They had over $1 million in net worth. And oftentimes they were just surprised. Oh my goodness, Martha, we did it. Well, how did that happen? Well, he said oftentimes then they had to go back and try to find out what these people had done. And that's what you should read the book for, because it's a source of inspiration to you. How did they live? How did they go about living, and so that they landed up with $1 million in maybe even the bank or net worth? So the book has come somewhat out of date, but the idea and the message is still very, very good. Obviously, $1 million isn't what it used to be, but you get the point. One of the things that I particularly found is that he found out that oftentimes these were people who simply took the risk to start their own small enterprise and worked hard at it. They oftentimes had a side income, or they worked for somebody else. They did take the risk of starting a small business and going through all the travail of entrepreneurship. As someone said, you don't become a millionaire by just working for a living. It usually takes more than that. So they were people who had invested in themselves and in perhaps a business that they could do, some enterprise they could run. It also turns out that most of them, he said a good percentage of them, So maybe not most of them, but a good share of them actually had a rather, they were religious. They were people of faith. They were generous people, but the faith factor was a significant factor in their lives. Again, not everybody, but above average. They were people of faith and the spiritual concerns of life. In fact, it was that wonderful paradox is the ones who made the money were not the ones who were in the business of making money. The ones who made the money weren't that concerned about making that money. It just kind of happened because of how they lived. And that was the millionaire next door. Just an idea for your thought and consideration. And now we turn the tables to the sociopath next door. Interesting ideas. I'm Stan Hustad, and we'll be right back. As I said, life is what happens. And there were 2 or 3 things in my life and the life of my family in which it became, I couldn't quite figure out how somebody could do what they did. How could they do that? It was so foreign to me in my own experience that I didn't know why they could do that. And so I had to investigate personality disorders, narcissism, and then sociopathy. And I came across a book that goes back now about 15 years. It's written by a woman named Martha Stout, and it was called The Sociopath Next Door. And here's what she said. Let me just give a description of this book, which I found very helpful, by the way. Is it your lying, cheating ex-husband? Your sadistic high school gym teacher? The boss who loves to humiliate you and other people in meetings? The colleague who stole your idea and passed it off as her own? Well, in the pages of The Sociopath Next Door, you will realize that your ex was not just misunderstood. He may be a sociopath, and your boss, and your teacher, and your colleague. They may be sociopaths too. Now, of course, right now we're very much involved. The guy who murdered those students, or at least is suspected, and the evidence is very strong, by knifing them. The guy who casually, 70 years old even, picks up a gun and walks into a New Year's festival and shoots 10 people. We are accustomed to think of sociopaths as violent criminals. But in The Sociopath Next Door, Harvard psychologist Martha Stout reveals, here we go, and this shocked me, that a shocking 4% of ordinary people, 1 in 25, has an often undetected mental disorder, the chief symptom of which is that person possesses no conscience. He or she has no ability whatsoever to feel shame, guilt, or remorse. 1 in 25 everyday Americans, therefore, is secretly a sociopath. They could be your colleague, your neighbor, even family, and they can do literally anything at all and feel absolutely no guilt. Now, I thought about that. You have 100 people in your office. Does that mean 4 of them are sociopaths? I shared this with a group of pastors, and they're dealing with problems. And I said, well, if you have 200 members in your congregation, there's a good chance you've got 6 to 8 sociopaths, even in your congregation. How do we recognize the remorselessness? How do we do that? One of their chief characteristics is a kind of glow or charisma that makes sociopaths more charming or interesting than the other people around them. They're more spontaneous, more intense, more complex, and oftentimes even sexier than everyone else, making them tricky to identify and leaving us easily seduced. Fundamentally, sociopaths are different because they cannot love. Sociopaths learn early on to show sham emotion, but underneath they are indifferent to others' suffering. They live to dominate and thrill to win. Yeah. And after reading this, some of the people in my life began to make a little more sense. Now, they weren't what I would call profoundly evil. They didn't do things that were greatly evil, but they came close, and a couple of them actually did do great harm. But if you would meet them at a party or didn't know anything more about them, oftentimes you'd find them rather charming. Unfortunately, I also found out in working in the financial services that sometimes even the top salespeople were sociopathic. Now, they might not have been full-blown sociopaths, but they were taught, hey, if someone doesn't like you, handle rejection and move on. Well, some of the ones who were good at that was because if you didn't like them, that was no problem. They didn't like you either. Boom, they're off to the next one. And so they had that ability to just keep coming because they didn't care whether you liked them or not. They weren't in the business of being liked. They were in the business of using you and making the sale and making more money. And when I shared that with a number of people in the industry, some of their eyes began, I could just see some of the people in their business or company came to mind. Think about that. Here's what Martha goes on to say in the description of the book. The fact is, we all almost certainly know at least one or more sociopaths already. Part of the urgency in reading The Sociopath Next Door is the moment when we suddenly recognize that someone we know, someone we worked for, or were involved with, or voted for is a sociopath. But what do we do with that knowledge? To arm us against the sociopath, Dr. Stout teaches us to question authority, suspect flattery, and beware the pity play. Above all, she writes, when a sociopath is beckoning, do not join the game. It is the ruthless versus the rest of us, and the sociopath next door will show you how to recognize and defeat the devil you know. That's something that I share with you out of personal experience, and right now, some of you are already telling stories and thinking of someone you met, and some of you are checking out right now, and I get no credit for this. You're checking out. I wonder if that book should be something that I should read. I found it very helpful in my own life. I'm Stan Hustad. These are not very inspiring, but hopeful, instructive, and maybe practical. The way we will survive in a difficult and tough world. Their ideas to help you do that. So there they are, perhaps helpful and interesting. Interesting ideas. I'm Stan Hustad, and we'll finish it up and be right back. For most of my life, I've had the advantage of having wonderful next-door neighbors, And hopefully, in fact, one of the persons who moved into a house next to us, after we got to know them, they said, because they were different. They were different people. I'll just say that. They were different. And they were aware of their differences. And they said to us, the realtor said that we would have wonderful neighbors because she knew you. And she said, you'll have wonderful neighbors next door. And that's part of the reason we bought the house. And it turns out that the realtor was absolutely right. I've had good neighbors, but I've had scoundrels too in my life, and probably will have a few more but I'm getting better at it, understanding and surviving it, and perhaps moving on from it. Hey, reach out to me. This is part of the coaching experience that we give, and we have a lot of experience in that, and we can help you understand the times and know what to do in a variety of ways. Stan Hustad at gmail.com, Stan Hustad at gmail.com. Check us out, and you'll find out that there's a whole lot of things that we can help you do as a performance coach, as a broadcaster, as someone who has a little bit of wisdom, insight, and truth, and is willing to share it with others. And I will always pronounce a blessing on you. That's what you always do. Bless others. Always. Be a blessing. Best and blessings to you. Until next time on Interesting Ideas. Bye for now.